This is the centre drive dog shaft. We will replace the shaft and the bearings. We have taken the cover panels off to reveal the top drive assembly. This is the shaft here, and the bearings are beneath this plate sprocket that we are going to replace. We will start by marking the cam and the hub. This is for the assemblies that have the pin that is driven through here. In this video we're going to update this to the new system. If you are only replacing the bearings, it will be necessary to mark the reference between this hub, this cam and this shaft before starting. We've used a felt pen to mark these three components. It is important to note the position of this cam before disassembly. I have rotated around so that this edge lines up with this edge of the proximity switch. We'll take a photograph of that before continuing. We can now see that the drive dog tag through the centre line is roughly centre of the fan shafts. So we'll take a photo of that too for our reference when we are putting it back together. Using a 10mm spanner, undo these two nuts and we can move this proximity bracket out of the road so that we can remove the plate sprocket. Remove the drive chain. Grab the jockey sprocket and you can push that forwards to loosen the chain off so that we can take it off the small sprocket first. Using a pin punch, drive the select pin all the way through the boss. Place a cardboard box inside the oven chamber so that when we drive the shaft through, it can fall into the cardboard box and not damage anything inside the oven. Using a suitable drift, you can drive the shaft through into the oven chamber. Being careful not to bruise the end of the shaft. Aluminium drifts are most suitable for this job. The centre shaft has been driven all the way through and the sprocket has been removed. Make sure any spaces or packing that go here are kept in order, as they will be required if you are going to use the same plate sprocket again to maintain sprocket height. This is the shaft assembly as it has been removed. Notice that the bearing is still attached to the shaft. If you're reusing this shaft, you'll have to take this bearing off and exchange it for the new bearing. And prior to fitting the new shaft and the new bearing back up into here, we must get the actual bearing and check for size. This bearing is a nice clearance fit. If it is not a nice clearance fit, please use a die grinder or a stone on the end of a drill and grind out the actual housing until the bearing is a nice slide in slide out fit like that. The top bearing can be driven from the inside of the oven chamber out using your aluminium drift again. We can now fit the replacement shaft complete with Teflon seal and bearing. We are using a block of timber between the gantry and the drive dog plate. You can use whatever material you have available to you to hold this into position. We can now fit the top bearing into position. If you are using the original sprocket, put any spaces that came off back on. We today are going to replace the sprocket, so we'll use the large flat washer that comes with the kit. Before we assemble the top plate sprocket and hub assembly, it is important that we understand how this adjusts. Using a dummy shaft out of the oven with a shaft collar to lock this bearing into position, we will assemble it and see how it adjusts. The first part to go on will be this washer Now we'll put the plate sprocket on next. We'll fit the boss and the keyway next. It is important to note that the holes through the boss are a clearance. They are only threaded in the plate sprocket itself. These 3 bolts go all the way through the boss and into the plate sprocket. They have nuts on them that are done up firm, so that the boss is locked to the plate sprocket. The centre shaft is free. This bolt here is still loose, but it is threaded into the plate sprocket and goes all the way through. If we look at this from the other side, we can see that that bolt goes all the way through, taps onto the flat washer, and the other ones go to clearance. So to adjust the height of the plate sprocket, we can turn this thread up and down, and that will affect the height at which the plate sprocket runs in the machine. So when we get the height that we are happy with, we can lock it in position. So using this 1 bolt here for adjustment, turning it up and down, and using the steel rule to go off onto your next sprocket, we can adjust the height of the plate sprocket up and down. When the correct height has been achieved, we can lock this nut off, lock the grub screws onto the shaft, then we'll loosen off these three nuts using your fingers only, wind these bolts down until we feel them touch the flat washer underneath, and then lock those positions off. We have fitted the plate sprocket to the oven. We have checked to make sure that the block of timber between the gantry and the drive plate is still in position and is still firm. As we bench demonstrated before, we're now going to wind this plate sprocket height down until it lines up with this sprocket. So if I adjust that now and wind that down until we are perfect at that point. It is best to use this small sprocket when doing this procedure. The 2 grub screws have been tightened. This nut has been locked off. We can now wind these 4 bolts down until we feel them touch the washer underneath. We can now remove the timber packing. After the timber packer has been removed, it is important to double check our plate sprocket height. We will now fit the centre cam. To do this, we need to reinstate the proximity bracket. The proximity plate has been refitted. It is still loose, and we will tighten this when we can get it into position with the cam. We will turn the drive dog around until the centre line of the shaft, the drive dog and the oven shaft all line up, so it's approximately there. Now that the shaft has been positioned, we can work out the best fit for our cam plate, which would be like that. As long as we are within 10 degrees of movement, this will be acceptable. I've loosened off the nuts so we can put this plate underneath like that. We will tighten the nut up and adjust the proximity bracket to suit. Tighten the proximity bracket. Ensure that the gap between the proximity and the cam plate is 2 to 3 millimeters, and that the height of the proximity matches the cam plate. The chain has been reinstalled. It is important to test run this before leaving site. ensuring that we do not have any chain noise from badly matched sprocket heights, and that the proximity switch is turning off and on as it comes past the cam. Ensure that the height between the driving dog and the top of the gantry boss goes to clearance. We can test this by moving it backwards and forwards. A minimum clearance of 3 mm is required. If the driving dog is too long, it is acceptable to cut the bottom off with a grinder.